Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is William Betterbide. I'm a student staff here at the Hinckley. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Strongmen, the Future of Authoritarianism, and we are excited to partner with the Tanner Humanities Center for this event. The Tanner Humanities Center advances humanities exploration and engagement through public outreach, academic research, and educational enrichment. The activities reflect a vision of the humanities as not only relevant, stimulating, and cutting edge, but also essential for developing critical thinking, tolerance, and respect on campus and in the community. This week's Tanner Humanities Center speaker is Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She writes about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and the threats these systems present to democracies around the world. Her most recent book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, looks at how illiberal leaders use propaganda, corruption, violence, and machismo, as well as how they can be defeated. She will be joined in conversation by Julie Alt, an associate professor in the Department of History, Sean Lawson, professor in the Department of Communication, and Yuri No, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. Today's conversation will be moderated by Jacqueline Sheehan, an assistant professor in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. So we're going to start with some reactions from our panel here. They'll all kind of discuss how Dr. Ben-Ghiat's book intersects with their various expertise from political science, history, and communications. So we'll start with Yuri.
Sure. So I would like to speak to the role of women's rights in authoritarian entrenchment and democratic backsliding. So in recent years, in both democratic and authoritarian contexts, incumbents have increasingly exploited women's rights to consolidate their power. So examining both adoption and suppression of women's rights is very important to deepen our understanding of democratic erosion in various global contexts. So on the one hand, authoritarian regimes have utilized women's rights reforms as a strategic tool to improve their international standing and obscure their undemocratic practices. So for example, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia exemplifies this approach. So they have adopted high-profile reforms, such as lifting the ban on women driving and easing male guardianship requirements. So these measures have portrayed Saudi Arabia as a reform-oriented nation to the international community. American media, for example, has covered it extensively and very positively. But this image of progress masks a very troubling reality, as Saudi women continue to face systematic discrimination and activists advocating for more substantial reforms have been jailed, detained, and tortured. But by leveraging these reforms, the Saudi government has managed to actually deflect attention away from its undemocratic practices and ongoing human rights abuses. So in my own research, I show that such women's rights reforms that were implemented in such a top-down manner without citizen deliberation or support are not durable. So I show how gender reforms in these contexts are easily rolled back, revealing the superficial nature of how these reforms and when they are not supported by the broader democratic processes and widespread public support. So in democratic contexts, more or less, leaders have also manipulated women's rights policies to strengthen their rule while eroding democratic norms. So in Turkey, in Hungary, in Brazil under Bolsonaro, and in the United States, they've all adopted policies that undermine women's rights in order to galvanize their conservative support base. So these moves have restricted reproductive rights, for example, among others, and framed their actions as defending traditional values and family values, all while simultaneously attacking feminist movements and other gender equality initiatives. So this suppression of women's rights has consistently been accompanied by broader democratic backsliding, such as threatening judicial independence and suppressing press freedom. So Ruth writes about it in her book and mentioned yesterday that these autocrats are just seeing everyone as an asset and a tool to consolidate power. So women and women's rights have unfortunately become just another tactic to consolidate power. So understanding the instrumentalization of women is very important. We gain deeper insights into how autocrats undermine democratic norms and maintain their dominance. And in more democratic contexts in the United States, the suppression of women's rights should serve as an early warning for democratic decline, signaling deeper structural issues in governance and civil liberties. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor No. So now we'll hear from Professor Alt, Professor of History.
Yeah. All right, thank you, everyone, for being here. As Jackie said, I'm a professor of European history, and actually my specialty is in modern Germany with a focus on communist East Germany and Eastern Europe more broadly. So in the few minutes I had here, what I wanted to do was step back and think a little bit about legacies of authoritarianism in Germany, and sort of, we could apply that more broadly perhaps, and make a connection or two to the present. So first, right, Germany is often cited as one of the main examples of 20th century authoritarianism in Nazi Germany and under Hitler. And many people already know a lot about that through popular culture, through reading histories, et cetera. But part of what I wanted to think about was what comes after authoritarianism, and how important that is. In the German context, of course, Germany was divided and occupied by the four Allied powers. And in the Cold War, right, then there are two Germanys that emerge. West Germany, which is a liberal democratic state, and communist East Germany, which is a second authoritarian dictatorship. And what's interesting here is that the two states confronted their past of authoritarianism very differently. So especially in West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, the generation that came of age in 1968 really confronts the past. What did our parents, what did our leaders do during World War II and the Holocaust? And of course, because it's German, they have an excellent, very long word for this, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. But in East Germany, that's not the case, right? There's not as much open discussion of what happened during World War II. It's primarily a state-focused narrative about communist resistance to the Nazis at the expense of discussing anything else, like the Holocaust, genocide, and the Nazis' many other crimes. So if we fast forward to the end of the to the end of the Cold War, in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, you have a moment where these two different case studies, right, this one country, same past, but different trajectories for the last 45 years, come back together and have to think about a common past despite 45, almost 50 years of growing apart. And what we see now, 30 years, 35 years beyond that, is the rise of a far-right party again in Germany, the AfD, or the Alternative for Germany. And interestingly, its greatest electoral successes have been in the former East Germany, and the part of Germany that lived through not one but two authoritarian regimes in the 20th century. And most recently, September 1st, there were a series of statewide or provincial elections in former East Germany where the AfD won first place in Thuringia and came in a close second place in Saxony. And so, right, what we see here is actually the first time a far-right party has won a statewide parliamentary election since the end of World War II in one of the hotbeds, right, of 20th century authoritarianism. And there is a third election this coming Sunday on the 20th in a third of the 5 former East German provinces in Brandenburg. So we'll see what happens there next. So I'm not saying the division of Germany is to blame for the AfD's rise, and also the AfD has many supporters in the former West Germany as well as in the former East. But if I make two sort of points in conclusion, one is that despite the fact that West Germans thought that they had really confronted the past and overcome authoritarianism and become a democratic state, we see that in fact the AfD has popularity there now as well. And my second point is that we have to continue talking about confronting the past to create a better, more democratic future, and to continually fight back and push back against the creep of authoritarian personalities and authoritarian trends. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Alt. And now we'll hear from Professor Lawson from Communications.
Yeah, thank you. So it's an honor to be on a panel with my colleagues and with Professor Ben-Ghiat, whose work I absolutely love. I told her last night, I finished reading her book and immediately went back to the start and started reading it again. I'm like, man, there's so much here. It's going to take 2 passes to take all of this in. But 2 of the main things that I took away from it that are related to my research, which I'll say a little bit here in a second, is number 1 is the transnational nature of many authoritarian movements, which we have seen historically and that she talks about in her book, and we're seeing again now. And second is the central role of technologies and tactics of communication on the part of authoritarians, and in particular, the use of new communication technologies and the innovative use of cutting-edge communication technologies for their day, whether that's film and radio, in a lot of the cases that Professor Ben-Ghiat talks about, or in our case, and in the research that I do, cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures of cyber conflict, the use of social media, AI, machine learning, et cetera. And that's really what my research has been focusing on in the last several years. In general, I focus on science, technology, and security with an emphasis on information and communication technologies, but more specifically focus on public policy discourses around cybersecurity, international cyber conflict, and more recently, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, or as we say in cybersecurity, the TTPs of malign influence campaigns. So in 2020, I published a book with Routledge, which was a critique of the US public policy discourse around cyber conflict and cybersecurity, and I argued that we have tended to focus too much on the technical aspects of these things. We've expected that cyber attacks are going to lead to, things going boom or the lights going out, and that society will collapse when that happens. And that really hasn't happened. It didn't even happen with the pagers. Don't get me started on that. But instead, I argued that really what we were witnessing in 2016 was the emergence of something much broader and more dangerous, which I called cyber-enabled political warfare. And then in 2022, a colleague of mine and I published a book with MIT where we looked more specifically at Russian and domestic use of these malign influence TTPs, and argued that a unique sort of combination of new technologies and techniques like social media, big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, combined with targeted ad technologies, were allowing for the emergence of an individualized, targeted form of malicious and malign communication that could be carried out in mass. And so we called this mass personal social engineering, and we drew on the rich history of the term social engineering from both the hacker subculture in the United States, but also the history of that term as applied to discussing manipulative politics, right? So we've all heard that term social engineering, don't click on a phishing link, but we've also heard people refer to certain political tactics as social engineering. And we argued that what we were seeing from the Russians and also domestically was representative of a merging of both of those senses of the term social engineering. And in fact, we just learned from the DOJ and some of the documents that they released with some indictments in the last couple of weeks that in fact the Russians call what they are doing social engineering as well. And then more recently, I published a piece where I argued that we're actually seeing an evolution of these tactics in Ukraine, where we're moving beyond just mass personal social engineering, which we argue is mostly focused on influence and persuasion, but instead we're increasingly seeing what I'm calling mass personal information warfare, where the goal is not merely persuasion or influence, but increasingly coercion, threats, and intimidation, again on that sort of mass, but also individualized, highly targeted to individuals or small groups kind of level. So how does this relate to the rise of authoritarianism in our own domestic politics? I think there's two main ways. Number one is Of course, we see, especially just in the last couple of weeks, continued efforts at interference in our domestic politics from foreign actors, especially foreign actors that would like to push us in the direction of authoritarianism. So Russia is one of the big actors here. That's not really new. But we also see homegrown use of these tactics where our own domestic movements are sort of learning and emulating what foreign adversaries are doing, and they're bringing it back home. But in addition, what we've learned in the last couple of weeks, in particular from the DOJ's indictments of some employees for RT, which is a Russian propaganda outlet, is that there is direct coordination between domestic authoritarian movements and media operations, tenant media in particular, far-right influencers like Tim Pool, both of whom were being directly funded by RT, which in turn is directly supported, we just learned in the last 5 days, from offensive cyber operations units in Russian intelligence. Yeah, so I could give a lot more specific examples of particular operations that we've learned about just in the last couple of weeks and stretching back to just the last year or so. But I know our time is short, so I'll leave it there. If you want to know more about specific examples that we're seeing of these kinds of activities, I'm happy to speak to that, and as well as some ideas of what I think we can potentially do about it.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lawson. So now we've heard a little bit from the experts on our panel, and I want to mention before we hear from Professor Ben-Ghiat a little bit about how I think these interventions speak to the comparative nature of the book. For those of you that haven't read it, it's divided into these categories, and I think that the way that it's laid out makes it really approachable for people from different disciplines to all get something out of it. So we can see through these responses how the book is very concerned with gender, right? The strong man, the man side of this strong man, as Professor No so helpfully highlighted for us. These kind of suppressions of women's rights are part of authoritarian regimes, and any kind of what we might view as an advancement of women's rights is always cloaking another kind of suppression of democracy. And so I think that's a really important observation. That's also very clear in Dr. Ben-Ghiat's book, the way that masculinity is an important part of authoritarianism. And I think Professor Alt's response also speaks to an important part of Dr. Ben-Ghiat's book is its long perspective. We get to see how these authoritarian regimes evolve from the 1930s to today, right? And how we deal with this question of authoritarianism. Often in the US, we've said, oh, it couldn't happen here, right? Because we are a model democracy. But I think that this rise of the far right in Germany, we have our own problems in the US, right? Democracy is no longer an important value for a certain generation of Americans or for a certain sector of Americans when it had often been one of the most important parts of our identity. And I think Professor Lawson's also intervention was so interesting here because it speaks also to this evolution of the way that authoritarians have used technology over time. And technology has been a very important part of authoritarian power, from film to today, other means, right? And how we have often viewed perhaps technological advances as making things more democratic, right? But I think there was a lot of technological optimism, we called it, right at the turn of the century in the early 2000s. And time has only gone to show that those advancements, right, that technology will be co-opted by authoritarian regimes, right? And so we have to be careful about having too much optimism about those technologies. So we'd love to hear Dr. Ben-Ghiat, your responses to this, and then after she responds, we'll open it up to the audience, and I'd love to hear also from some of my students that are here. I'm excited to see you guys, and probably other students I don't know. I'm excited to hear from you too. Great.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for coming, and especially students, whether you are here because you had to come or I teach, so I know, or for whatever reason you're here, thank you for being here. And thank you for these really rich interventions from so many different perspectives, and it just speaks to the array of fields through which you can study authoritarianism. And one of the things about authoritarianism is there's an ambition to have everything linked. And originally, we talked about this a tiny bit last night, the totalitarian, which is rarely realized, is that the Nazis had this term coordination, that not only all propaganda would be coordinated, and ideally with tiny variations for each constituency, like in marketing and segmentation, that kind of thing, but policies would be coordinated across spheres of life. So that's why we have technology, we have women and gender, and ideally it actually all relates in a, quote, well-run authoritarian regime, although they're never well run. And one of the reasons I wrote Strongmen was to debunk myths about the outcomes, where we hear, Mussolini made sure to say he was going to make the trains run on time. Italy was going to become modern. But if you have a one-party state, no strikes allowed, how do you know if the trains are running on time or not? And the outcome of authoritarian regimes for economic and certainly for social life, for emotional well-being, health, is usually terrible, and often leading to war or genocides or ethnic, separatism, all kinds of things that are not about well-being, because authoritarians don't care about the well-being of the population. They only care about themselves. This is the leaders. So Yuri talked this very important point about how authoritarian regimes will have a double track of women's rights. They will do something that is a concept called gender washing, which is not my word. It's two female political scientists, and Saudi Arabia is a great example, where you do advance, you do liberalize, but you always have to ask why. Why is it happening? So Saudi Arabia, we were saying last night, is doing every kind of washing, sports washing, where you host all these, like Hitler did this in 1936 Olympics. You host a big thing, and then you make sure people are not beating up people in the streets while all the tourists are there. So that's one washing. So gender washing is it's part of it's part of many authoritarian and illiberal states today, where you seem to be promoting women's rights, but either the context is highly repressive, as in Saudi Arabia, or the concept of women, what kind of women can be rewarded, is very restricted. I'll give you an example. In far-right Hungary, with Viktor Orban, and Italy, which has a neo-fascist prime minister, Meloni, and Orban had appointed the first female president of Hungary. She had to resign recently, but so they were all about gender washing, we're breaking the glass ceiling, but they were all about, I'm a mother before anything else, and I am for the natural family, a man and a woman. And in Hungary, any other kind of family is outlawed, as is the teaching of LGBTQ materials, intersex people, transgender. You have no bureaucratic existence in Hungary. So you can be a woman in power, but only if you're a certain kind of woman who puts motherhood first. And we have echoes of this in our country, like the attacks on the childless cat women, By the way, I've been getting, ever since I started doing, writing for the public, writing in CNN, I have a child, so I'm not, and I don't have a cat. But I started getting these things, you're part of the childless left. And I was like, what is the childless left? This was years ago. So to speak to propaganda, sometimes these discourses are there in a fringe way, and then their time can come where they can get co-opted into like a major thing if the time is right for kind of repressive policies and actions to do with women. And then childlessness gets roped into demographic schemes that are part of all these far-right countries. So I wanted to mention that. So the gender washing concept is really important. And for Julie's comments, the lesson is once these guys get in the political system, it's really hard to get rid of them, even if they die, like for many, many years after they're dead. And once they get a hold, even if they don't wreck democracy totally, like Berlusconi in Italy, they damage it. And they suck the life out of their parties. It's called hollowing out. Authoritarians, this is another political science concept, they hollow out institutions. And they do this by getting rid of anybody who is not loyal to the party line, the mass firings, and staffing it with yes people. And so there's no values except the values of the party line and the leader. And this happens across the board with authoritarian regimes. So parties can become just like imprints of the leader. And so that happened in Italy with Berlusconi. And he had to resign. He had massive amounts of corruption trials, impeachments, and he was convicted, became a convicted felon. That's familiar. And guess what? So he's dead now. And in the last European elections, so he was dead, the main slogan, the logo of his party, which still exists, said Berlusconi in really big letters. And I was like, he's dead. Why are they? It's like they have no identity beyond him, even though he's dead now. And they just named the major Milan airport after him, even though he's a convicted felon. So it's very hard to get rid of them. And we're in an era where pretty much all the mass murderer dictators are being rehabilitated often by other dictators or dictator wannabes. So Stalin's having his moment thanks to Putin, who just opened a Stalin Studies Center. Xi Jinping, it's all about Mao. He's like Mao light, right? But we're not supposed to talk about he's one of the biggest mass murderers of all time. And so it's inevitable. We have also attempts at rehabilitating Hitler, including in our country with Tucker Carlson, saying, Churchill was bad and Hitler was good, and platforming neo-Nazis. There's all that going on. And so you could flip it around, and it's very disturbing that Alternative for Deutschland is getting this kind of traction now. But you could also flip it and say, considering what was going on in other countries for some time, they were pretty robust at keeping them out for a long time, right?
Yeah, there's still the idea that it's not acceptable to go into coalition with them, right? And so there have been, Germany's current coalition is constructed around 3 very disparate parties because they have so avoided working with this far-right party. But.
Yeah, and I want to mention something that I just saw this article in the Journal of Democracy, and I was on the plane, and I read the abstract, and then, as often happens, crappy Wi-Fi on planes. I was not able to read the rest. So, but it's very important because it proves as far as their data goes, what I always thought of is that for democratic backsliding, it's often, they found, these scholars, that it's often less to do with the deficiencies of the democracy than with a failure to gatekeep in the first place, to keep these dangerous individuals out at the very beginning, right? That's what you have to do, or to refuse to bring them in, to mainstream them, to normalize them. You save yourself a huge amount of disaster by doing gatekeeping. And so now there's more and more research kind of showing this empirically. What, if you're a historian, is pretty obvious. So in our country, what really propelled me to, I said this last night, to start writing for CNN, being out there, doing all these interviews, was when Trump was a candidate, January 2016, didn't have the nomination yet, and he said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any followers. Now, and this really goes beyond whether you are a lifelong Republican. No, in my humble opinion, no candidate should be saying they want to shoot someone. That's a bar that's a little too low. But what he was saying is he was, if you study Duterte and Bolsonaro and all these people who, talk about violence on their way up, he was saying that he was personally capable of violence and that he would be approved of and even loved because of the violence. He wouldn't lose any followers. So that was a moment for gatekeeping. Somebody like that shouldn't be allowed in the system just on that alone if we want to have a system that's rule of law and not about violence. It seems like obvious. So I watched very carefully what happened, and in the next 2 weeks after that, and there were headlines about it, but people didn't know what to do about it. It was so strange, right? It was so extreme. So Jeff Sessions, like less than 2 weeks later, starts mainstreaming him, shows up at a MAGA rally, puts on the hat, and welcomes him into the GOP. And then he goes on Jimmy Fallon, and Jimmy Fallon tussles at Trump's hair and jokes with him, so we have mainstream of the media. So the way authoritarians think, strongmen, he's like, this didn't cost me anything. In fact, I got a lot of traction from all these different areas in society from it, so I'm going to continue. Had he had a different, he might have dialed back. I'm not saying he would have abandoned his candidacy, but he might have dialed that back. So that's an example. And truly, once in the conclusion to the book, I talk about the legacies and the memory. But just know that we're in a period where pretty much every dictator from the past is being rehabilitated. So finally, it's very important. I mean, there is no more important topic than the things you're working on now. And one of the reasons all the chapters, including the propaganda chapter, go over 100 years is I wanted to show what stays the same, like personality cults, and what is profoundly different today, so because of social media. And social media kind of soups up all of the elements and dynamics of propaganda. And I mentioned before, you want to have the same message going out with tiny variations so people don't get bored. But what social media has done is before, like talking like many 100 years ago, 50 years ago, people were consumers, where you'd read the paper, right? You would actually in Europe, go to the kiosk and buy the paper, and you would read it. Maybe you'd pass it on to a friend or something, but you were mostly just a consumer. Social media makes everybody producers because you pass it on, you share it, and you put a little meme, or you have your own, you share it and then you requote the top, so you have your own twist on it to make it seem fresh and new, right? So people are now producers as well as consumers, and that keeps the propaganda fresh. And of course also the pace of social media, the pace of news cycles, everything is speeded up. And so, but I wanted to go over one very important concept coming from Russian propaganda, the fire hose of falsehood. Because in the older days, I mean, conspiracy theories were always very important. Like all of Hitler's stuff about Jews, to some extent, was conspiracy theory. The Jews are behind everything. And a lot of the stuff we hear, anti-Semitic stuff, you could just plug in a different name. Before it was the Rothschilds, now it's George Soros. But you keep the same stuff. But Mussolini, for example, in 1939, he was a journalist, and he was super micromanager. He drove all the editors crazy. So even though he was dictator, he would call the editors of newspapers and say, I don't like this font you used. You got to use a different font. He was like super micromanaging. But he passed a law saying you couldn't use any question marks in headlines. Now, why would that be? Why doesn't a dictator want a headline with a question mark in it? Yeah, because it causes doubt, right? So here's one difference with the fire hose of falsehood and today's propaganda. Today's propaganda, it does censor things. It does old school stuff, but it adds a new dimension. Everything has a question mark. It's about spewing. The fire hose of falsehood is the Kremlin model. It's not only used by Russia, and it's the volume is why it's called a fire hose, right? And all the bots and all the things. But it's a mix of, banning certain things, half-truths, mostly outright lies, conspiracy theories, and then some things that like have a grain of truth. Like one of the, I talk about this in the book, one of the consistent themes is immigrants are coming over the border, right? They're going to wreck our whole country, our civilization. Now, this departs from a grain of truth because in that, immigrants do come over the border. They're always coming, right? They're always flying, but the rest is perhaps totally wrong. They're not coming to commit crimes. So sometimes, so the fire hose of falsehood is based on the ultimate goal is to raise so many questions and debase the notion of truth so that you don't know what's right and what's truth and what's fiction. And I have a quote from Hannah Arendt. So this is not, she recognized it many years ago that the ultimate goal was to make people in a state of exhaustion because you don't know what's true anymore and it's too hard to figure it out. And that's the goal, and that's true because of the volume of it today. Who knows what's true, right? And then there you get, paranoia. You also get people who demobilize. If you don't know what's true, you just give up. And certainly, sometimes, elderly people, they just can't. Like my mother was radicalized by Russia Today during the pandemic. And she lives in England. And she was a conservative who was very into the Queen. I have so many tea towels with the Queen's face on them. I grew up with all that. But really an old-fashioned conservative. During the pandemic, she couldn't go out anymore because they had lockdowns, and she's in a village, a small village. And she discovered Russia Today. And the way that Russia Today works is they use hosts on, this is for the TV part of it, they use hosts from the country. So my mom would say, oh, I discovered Russia Today, it's so great. And I'm like, Mom, that's Kremlin propaganda. She goes, no, it's not, they're British hosts. And we had the same thing with the recent DOJ. They use people from the target nation, and that's because they know that they're more likely to be trusted. So it's But my mother, during this time, she went from being a conservative to being totally pro-Putin. She loved Putin. We never heard about Putin before, believe me. And now it was Putin. And she also developed a rabid hatred of Biden, who also did not, I can tell you, we did not talk about Biden and Putin in our weekly calls. But now she was obsessed with Biden and obsessed with Putin. And then she got into great replacement theory, like rants about, like far-right rants. So I started sending her, like, Mom, here's my own article for CNN. Like, your daughter, I wrote this. She's like, you're just fake news. So I would hang up on her. And then I was like, you're not supposed to hang up. You're supposed, that's not, when you think of how do we correct this, whether you study authoritarian leader cults or disinformation, you're not supposed to hang up on them because the more you cast them aside, the more they're just going to go into their tribe. So you have to like hang with it, which is frustrating, and then be there when they're ready. And just to conclude, an interesting thing happened. Russia Today got banned when, as part of the sanctions, when Putin invaded Ukraine. So she didn't have it anymore. And so she stopped, like within a few weeks, she stopped talking about Putin. She did retain the paranoia about immigrants. So that's like a lesson where she retained certain things, because she's also got Murdoch and Sky News and all that. But she lost the very specific Kremlin things of the Putin stuff. So it's an object lesson in how important this research is, and authoritarians are a combination of surveillance state that's used in China very effectively and foreign influence operations. It's really daunting how sophisticated they are.
Great, thank you so much for that response. I'd like to, on that note about truth and falsehood and propaganda, open up the questions to the audience and encourage you guys to ask questions, right? Because there is a question mark at the end of this panel. So we've got a mic coming around over here.
The mic, please wait to ask your question until you have the mic. Thanks.
Okay, so my question is, in my experience working in politics and in my studies, I've heard time and time again about how the US will fall soon and the West is on the decline, but I have yet to see any real changes indicating that will happen soon, if not ever. Are we actually seeing a decline in Western powers, or is this a persuasion point by authoritarian powers akin to propaganda, such as the state of exhaustion mentioned?
I guess it depends what you mean by decline, like what are the metrics that you're using. Certainly a very important part of authoritarian propaganda, and this does not matter whether it's left or right, because I will remind everyone that Xi Jinping, who is a communist dictator, is allied with Putin. They're together. And their whole thing is to defeat democratic internationalism, all the concepts of human rights. They actually have a big influence campaign to get the language taken out of UN and other documents. They would like to curtail the power of important Western nations, and they have enablers who are vowing to withdraw the US from NATO if they get elected. You know who I mean. And the whole thing about great replacement theory and civilizational collapse is designed to get people into a state of existential despair. So who do they go for? A different model of civilization, which is authoritarian. And so Putin, since what we actually are exposed to now was developed by Putin. I have quotes in my book from 2012, 2013, where he talked about liberalization of society, gays being allowed to circulate, mixed faith marriages. All of this is causing decline and degradation and decadence. And that's a big part of the Russian playbook, which now has been exported to all the far-right parties and is becoming policy. So that's part of the Western decline. And in its place would be the triumphant new Russian Empire, China, and unfortunately, this goes with expansionism. So Russia on the move in Ukraine, China is looking at what Russia is doing, has its eye on Taiwan, because with these kinds of dictators, it's not just that they're going to have their perfect civilization and stay in their own lane. They have to expand, because the future of the West, the future of the world depends on our expansion at the expense of the West. So it is very instructive, if you want to follow further up on this, to go back and look what Putin was saying regularly also to international audiences of admirers over a decade ago, and how today it's coming out of Orban's mouth. Even like Bolsonaro in Brazil, he represented, he identified as the legacy of the white European colonizers. He was an evangelical Christian. So, and he was on the side of civilization. And so who loses? It's, Muslims, indigenous peoples. It's a kind of playbook that isn't restricted only to Europe.
Another question over here? Yes, I have a question. So my name is Jackson Tyler. Nice to meet you. I'm a poli-sci and international relations major out here. And I guess I'll ask the elephant in the room question. I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if you discussed this or not. But half my family's Jewish. We got out of Germany. We're pretty aware about the authoritarian tendencies that America is kind of pulling towards. How do you feel about Donald Trump? do you think that he is spreading these authoritarian tendencies? Do you think that he's going to become more dangerous, a threat to democracy? Yeah, I just want to hear your opinion on that because, I mean, you are the expert.
Mm-hmm. I think we, just as I talked, I don't know if you were here when I talked about him saying the gatekeeping stuff, when he said he could shoot someone. So that wasn't a very good start if you don't want to be considered dangerous. And I think that one of the lessons of history is it's really important to listen to what they're saying and take it seriously. And it's easy to feel, believe me, I get emails every day saying, you're just paranoid, you're hysterical, you're exaggerating. But I mean, there was already a lot of damage done in our society, including, since you mentioned being half Jewish, hate crimes over the time of it's not just when he was in office, and though remember the neo-Nazis being very fine people. I mean, one of the things he did in terms of making America more extreme is he created a big tent and he addressed himself to all kinds of extremists and all kinds of racists, from actual neo-Nazis to Southern racists to every kind of intolerant person. And so if you look at statistics from the FBI, from Southern Poverty Law Center, the people who track hate crimes and attacks on institutions, they all skyrocketed, and they have continued to skyrocket even because of January 6th, which broke a lot of taboos. So hate crimes against Jews, certainly hate crimes against Muslims, against LGBTQ people, against judges, threats against judges. Because one thing I want to say, and it's important to look for this, if you want to check somebody who's trying to destroy a democracy, one of the things you have to do is delegitimize and discredit all institutions and all figures who before were respected and given the benefit of the doubt. So judges, prosecutors, teachers, librarians, scientists, anybody who is involved with investigations and truth and data must be destroyed. And that goes with the destroying the truth thing. They also happen to be, some of these people, and journalists. So any of these categories, go and check the hate crimes and the threats. They've skyrocketed. Members of Congress, Republican as well as, because remember who was running for their lives on January 6th? It was Republicans as well as Democrats. And for whom was that noose on Capitol Hill? It was for Mike Pence, a far-right Christian warrior of very durable Republican, credentials. He was the intended victim, and he missed harm by a few seconds. Go and look at all that stuff. So there's already been a huge amount of damage, and so now, when he's saying that he wants to have a military tribunal for Liz Cheney, he's saying he's going to investigate and prosecute anybody who has threatened his freedom or who investigates him. He's going to deport 15 million people, which I'll remind everyone is the size of the population of Sweden, or Haiti, or Cuba. And he's going to build huge camps and have militarized sweeps. I think we have to take this seriously because the other people in the past talked this way and called people vermin. That's what fascists call people. And people were like, oh, Hitler, he's such a weirdo, or Mussolini, he's just a clown. Look at all his gesticulations. He's not going to do anything. And in the past, there are coups, and then things are bad immediately. Like a friend of mine lived through a coup in Uruguay. He's like, well, I left for school, and we were a democracy, and I came home, and I was lucky I came home, and we were not. But often it's over time, and it's gradual. Trump is saying he doesn't want it to be gradual, and his partners at the Heritage Foundation, et cetera, are saying, last time it was too slow. So we've learned it's not going to be slow this time. So and the last thing I'm going to say is we can always think that, oh, well, I'm not an immigrant, I'm not going to be a target, or I'm not Jewish, so who cares? The lesson is they never just go after one group. They start with one group. Now it's immigrants, or he's obsessed with immigrants and all his enablers. But other people will be targets because they've already been targets. So it's a long answer, but it's really important question. I prefer to take the risk of being called a hysteric and warn people, especially since I've been able to really predict. You can look up my pieces from around the inauguration, 17 and 2016. I've been able to predict what he would do. And I always wish I were wrong, but I haven't actually been wrong because of the historical patterns. So thanks for asking that.
For one more question.
I'll be more brief.
Hi, Keemon Dixon, poli-sci major. You've been very free in your association of language and depiction of the far right and conservatives, Republicans, yada, yada, yada. Do you have any type of critique or criticism of far left ideology that you can expand upon? I think that's a great balance to be able to have in this conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think one of the lessons that comes from resistance to autocracy is that nonviolent mass protest and nonviolent actions are key. Any kind of violence or threat or intimidation, of course, I personally don't approve, but it's not strategic. And when you look at the history of resistance, it is nonviolent protest. And why is that? Because if you have a resistance movement, you have to get what, again, political scientists call the pillars of support in society, the quote, respectable people. You want the bankers, you want the people who maybe, quote, count. You don't want to alienate them by preaching violence. Now, I'm not saying that, like, in Italy in 1943, you had civil war, and there were people who were like pacifists who ended up joining the resistance, but that's in the context of a world war. In domestic situations, nonviolent protest, and I just published a piece about love in my newsletter this morning, about how important love is, and bridge building, and unity, and I think that is true for the far left as well as the far right. So that's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you.
So I think we are about out of time, so thank you all so much for your questions, and I'll pass it back up to our panel moderator for closing remarks.
Okay, great. So yeah, now we have some time for some quick closing remarks from the panelists. If you'd like to end with some ideas, we can take it.
I mean, your question just got me thinking. I think the narrative that the US is falling and in decline, it's also a political narrative. And I'm always saying, okay, on the one hand, the economy. Look at the US economy. I do not think it's in decline. And it's actually been doing very, very well. So I think we have to be careful of the narratives that try to foster, like, rather than hopefulness, and again, looking at the facts, we have to be careful of the narratives that are trying to, instill fear or, very, very intense, like, pessimism. Yeah. So to me, all these are part of the political narrative if it's not reflected in the data. So I think that goes for many of the political narratives that we're seeing that Professor Ben Gia talked about.
I didn't really have anything planned, but just to build on what Yuri just said, Ray, as a historian, one of the greatest things you can do, and applies to every part of our life, is thinking critically about the information you're receiving. Who benefits from it? what seems plausible, what doesn't seem plausible, and why, whether you're looking at a document from hundreds of years ago or from the news story you're reading this morning, thinking critically, right, and pushing back against passive acceptance of the information you're hearing, overcoming that exhaustion from the Hannah Arendt quote a little bit ago is really, really important to maintaining a democracy. That's great.
Yeah, and I'll just say, as someone who studies current state and also history of conflict, military history as well, in some cases, I'll sort of riff a little bit on what Professor Benguiat was saying in response to your question, and I forgot your name, about critiques of the left. You never want to do what your adversary wants you to do, right? And one of the main narratives of the far right now is that the left is inherently violent, they're already violent, and they're going to be violent. And it can be, you know, we can all get emotional and be upset about what's happening in society, but we have to maintain an even keel, and we can't give in to that emotional desire to maybe express violent rhetoric, or certainly not to act out violence, whether that is in the context of protest or some other way that we might act out political violence, either you know, physically or rhetorically. Because if you are a person who is of the left or even of the center, and you just consider yourself as a centrist liberal, when you do those kinds of things, you're giving the folks that you view as harming society, as people who you potentially view as your adversary, you're giving them what they want. They want you to do that, because then they can say, see, we told you so, and they can use that as justification for their own violent rhetoric or use of physical political violence. So try to remain calm, try to remain nonviolent, both physically and in your political rhetoric.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for these lucid comments today about authoritarianism.
Good use of
it's really
lucid.
fascinating. Yeah, that was a shout out to your newsletter or your publication. So with that, we'd like to conclude, and thank you all for coming.